Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for tuning in. My name is Shun Inoue, and I work with the Japan Foundation New York Arts and Culture team. Welcome to the 7th episode in a JFNY Literary Series, in which we invite notable Japanese authors and their translators to discuss their work, speak on the art of translation, and touch on the current literary scene in Japan. We are proud to be running this series in consultation with the translators Allison Markin Powell, Jenny Tapley Takemori, and Lucy North, members of the collective Strong Women, Soft Power. Today, we have invited author Aoko Matsuda and her translator, Polly Barton. Our discussion today will be moderated by Professor Hitomi Yoshio. For those who are interested in reading more works by Aoko Matsuda, we have provided some links in the description below. And as usual, our esteemed interpreter Bethan Jones will be providing interpretation from Japanese to English and vice versa. And with that, I'd like to pass this on to Lucy-san, who will introduce our speakers for today, and I will see you all again at the end.
Great, thanks, Shun-san. It's my great pleasure to be representing the collective Strong Women Soft Power in today's discussion. We'll be following our usual structure. Our three guests will have a discussion, and at some point there'll be a reading. At the end, I'll come on and ask just a few questions on behalf of Strong Women Soft Power. So let me just give some quick bios of our three guests today, and a very warm welcome to you all. It's a real honor to have you. Aoko Matsuda is a writer and translator. In 2013, her debut book, Stackable, was nominated for the Yukio Mishima Prize and the Noma Literary New Phase Prize. Her novella, The Girl Who Is Getting Married, was published by Strangers Press in the UK in 2016. In 2019, her short story, The Woman Dies, was shortlisted for a Shirley Jackson Award. In 2021, her short story collection, Where the Wild Ladies Are, published by Soft Skull Press in the US, and Tilted Axis in the UK, received the World Fantasy Award for Best Fantasy Fiction Translated into English, and the Firecracker Award, celebrating books that make a significant contribution to our literary culture. She has translated work by Karen Russell, Amelia Gray, and Carmen Maria Machado into Japanese. Polly Barton is a writer and Japanese translator based in the UK. In 2019, she won the Fitzcarraldo Editions Essay Prize for her debut book, 50 Sounds, a personal dictionary of the Japanese language. Her translations have featured in Granta, Catapult, The White Review, and Words Without Borders, and her full-length translations include Spring Garden by Tomoka Shibasaki and There's No Such Thing as an Easy Job by Kikuko Tsumura. Hitomi Yoshio is Associate Professor of Global Japanese Literary and Cultural Studies at Waseda University. She specializes in modern and contemporary Japanese literature with a focus on women's writing. She is also a literary translator, and her translations of Miyako Kawakami's works have appeared in literary journals and the Penguin Book of Japanese Short Stories. She received her PhD from Columbia University in 2012. So please, over to you, Hitomi-san.
Okay, thank you, Lucy-san, for the introduction. I'd like to first thank Japan Foundation New York for giving us this opportunity to have a conversation with two of the most exciting authors and translators writing today, Aoko Matsuda and Polly Barton. And I'm also thankful to the amazing women of Strong Women Soft Power who have been spearheading this conversation series. I remember attending the all-day symposium in Jinbocho that was held by the Strong Women Soft Power Collective in 2017, where I met the three founding members, Lucy North, Allison Markin Powell, and Jenny Tapley Takemori. And since then, their Translators Collective has done amazing work in supporting female writers and translators, and this Japan Foundation New York Literary Series is their latest endeavor. So I've enjoyed watching all of the other videos, and I'm very grateful to the three women for bringing the community of readers, writers, and translators together. Today, we have Aoko Matsuda and Polly Barton for a conversation about Where the Wild Ladies Are. And I've been a big fan of both of their works for several years now, so I'm particularly excited to be moderating this session. And special thanks to Bethan Jones for her brilliant interpretation, as always. So Where the Wild Ladies Are, this is the Japanese book cover, is a collection of short stories that could be called a modern feminist take on Japanese folktales and ghost stories. It was originally published in 2016, and the English translation came out in 2020 by Soft Skull Press in the US and Tilted Axis Press in the UK. And I have the UK version here with me. And the book has been praised for its brilliant imagination and for presenting a strong feminist voice in a non-Western context. And it was awarded the World Fantasy Award in 2021, and the translation also won the English Pen Award in 2020. So congratulations to both of you. The stories included in the collection are loosely linked with some overlapping characters and settings. And some characters appear only once, while others appear in multiple stories. And by characters, I mean not only living characters, but also the ghosts, who are just as energetic and vivacious as the living. And in fact, the ghosts seem to be even more full of life than the living, whom they reveal themselves to. And it is the female ghosts who are the true stars of this collection. They're no longer shackled by the bounds of society. And released from social norms and obligations, they seem liberated and happy. And they come back to the world of the living to help out and give strength to the various women living and struggling in contemporary society. These young women, the living, are all somewhat oppressed by social norms and the sexism and misogyny that exist all around them. So the ghosts are there to protect and to heal or to soothe the living. And at first, the living do not notice, but gradually they begin to see the ghosts and accept their help. And together they create a bond, a kind of friendship that helps the living survive the world as it exists around them. And sometimes, for example, if there is a particularly strong woman among the living, like the woman in the story titled The Jealous Type, then they get recruited to become a ghost after their death. So they too can come back to the world of the living to help out. So in the world of Where the Wild Ladies Are, it is suggested that this system of matching the ghosts with the living is something that happens in an entirely natural and seemingly unsurprising kind of way, and can be accepted and appreciated as a natural part of existence. So death is not so much an end of life, but a continuation. And the dead circle back to mix with the living. So I want to move to my questions. I can think of many words to describe this book, but one word that comes to my mind is humor. I think this book is so humorous, and the energy that is created by this humor is strongly tied to feminism, which is another key word when describing Aoko Matsuda as a writer. So Aoko-san, let me begin with a general question about Where the Wild Ladies Are. What was your inspiration for writing this book? How did it come into being? And how important are the words humor and feminism for you and for this book in particular?
ご紹介ありがとうございました。今日はよろしくお願いします。私がなぜおばちゃんたちのいるところを書いたかというと、私はすごく小さい時から怪談とかギリシャ神話とかそういうフォークテールがすごく好きで、読んだり見たりして育ってきて、どっちかというと暗いタイプなので、なんて言うんだろう、アダムスファミリーのウェンズデーとか、ビートルジュースのウィノナライダーとかにどっちかというと共感を覚えるようなタイプだったんですね。で怪談とかもすごく好きで、なんていうか、特に女性の怪物だとか女性の幽霊が出てくる作品にものすごく心を惹かれてる自分がいて、そういう女性の幽霊たちが大好きだったんですね。それでただ成長していくにつれてそういう作品の中で女性が結構ひどい目にあって殺されたりとか、普通に考えて女性なんていうんですかね、女性差別なんだけれども、その場ではそういう概念がまだないから、すごく当たり前のものとして女性がひどい目にあったりとかひどく扱われたりとかするようなケースをなんか理解できるようになってきて、そうなった時にやっぱそれはそれで悲しいじゃないですか。なのでなんか読みながら2つの気持ちになるっていうか、その女性の幽霊とか怪物は好きなんですけど、同時にその物語に触れると悲しい気持ちにもなるっていうところ、それが大人になってきたらそういうふうに感じるようになってきたんですね。 それでなんていうか、まあそういうふうになってきたから、もし自分が今から彼女たちの物語を書くとしたらどういう物語にするだろうかっていうような観点から物語を書きたいなというふうに思うようになりました。それがおばちゃんたちのいるところになったんですけれど、そうね。で、書きながら自分がやりたいなと思ったのは、その物語の中で殺されてしまったりとか無残に扱われてた女性たちと今の現代の女性たちの共通点っていうのがあって、それはやっぱりその家父長制的な男性優位社会に生きていたっていう共通点があるんですね。その部分で過去の女性たちと現代の女性たちはつながってるわけです。だからそういうその同じシステムの中で生きている生きていた時代は違うんですけれども、その女性たちが手をつないで共にサポートし合って生きていけるような物語が書きたいっていうふうに書いてるうちに思うようになりました。この作品集ではできるだけ楽しさを一番に持って考えたいなと思ったっていうので、特に楽しさを意識して書きました。それでフェミニズムはまあ常に意識しているところなんですけど、まあその普通のことなので普通に書いてたらそうなるっていう話だと思うんですけれど、そういう意味でやっぱり、特に今回だけっていうことではなくいつもそうなんですけど、まあ自分としては普通のこととしてやっぱりそのフェミニズムが搭載された物語を書きたいっていうのがあります。
It's really interesting to hear that the emotion that originally drove you to write this work was actually the sadness that you felt towards the ghosts, and that the sadness somehow through your creative process turned into joy and humor. And I think humor and laughter has a kind of explosive power to counter these, patriarchal society and oppressive systems that you talked about. That feminist undertone is so present in your work, and I think it's so tied to your humor and the way that you express humor and laughter. So yeah, that was really interesting. So what about you, Polly? How did you understand the significance of the book and what drew you to it originally?
Yeah, thank you. So nice to be here with you both / all. So my first point of contact, I suppose, with Where the Wild Ladies Are was I was asked to translate the story Smartening Up for the Japan issue of Granta. And I think at that stage that I was translating, that was the only story from the collection that Aoko had written. And I think I was just really struck by it. I mean, I think most of the stories in the collection actually kind of function as a microcosm of the whole collection, but that one in particular really does. There is so much humor. And I think, when we say humor, we can mean a number of different things by humor. And I kind of think that Aoko does them all, we have genuinely laugh out loud funniness. Then there's this kind of just a very playful, creative inventiveness that is kind of informs a lot of the decisions as well as the dialogue and kind of just suffuses. And then I think there's also something that I want to call, and which I see is really key to this collection, silliness, which is really for me what makes it such a joy to read, and I think really ties into what Aoko was saying about kind of deliberately wanting to kick back against this feeling that only very serious, straight things can actually be doing radical things in literature, or actually genuinely challenging, norms and traditions and so on and so forth. So I think it was the joy of it and the humor, but in combination with this sense that actually this story is doing something really, really quite different and really quite radical, you know, I think that I see this book as having quite a serious, I don't know if this is necessarily like obvious to me at the point that I first started working on it, but as I worked through it, it became more and more clear to me that, you know, it has a kind of almost like a serious philosophical agenda in some sense of, maybe philosophical is the wrong word, but it's a genuine agenda of addressing what it means to find people scary and how that is, or to find things scary, and that's how that is tied in with otherizing and ostracizing and alienating people, and you know the links with that, and the position of women in society throughout time, you know, which I mean I think in all cultures there's a real predominance of female ghosts, but I think within the Japanese tradition that's particularly, you know, universal. And yeah, so I suppose for me, I kind of feel like this collection is doing everything that I would want a book to be doing, especially one that I was going to translate, because I suppose I really am drawn to work that is quite humorous, or at least playful.
So were there any aspects of humor that, you know, you talked about the juxtaposition of like the humor in Aoko's work and this more seriousness, the serious agenda. Were there aspects that you felt were difficult to bring over into English? Or on the other hand, can you think of places that you felt, oh, I just hit the nail right on the head, like I really got it right? Or were there any parts that you used that were particularly creative in your translation?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were parts which were really difficult to translate and parts where it just worked. But often, for me, the way that I see that, it's really less to do with me as a translator and more about, you know, the actual kind of languages. And I'm talking, I suppose, specifically on the level of, you know, quite specific puns or kind of playing around with language that Aoko does. So like, to take one example of each, in the story with Gum, A Day Off. So in Japanese, he's the toad is Gama-chan, which is a play on Gama, which means toad. You know, and when I mean this, I suppose this mental process that I'm about to describe, I feel like goes for so many translational decisions I make. It keeps happening each time that when I first encounter this thing, I think like, oh no, you know, what am I going to do? And I feel my heart really sinking, and it's like, this is lost, and I'm going to have to find some way around it, and yet it won't really work. And then the more that sort of the rest of the translation comes together, the more I realize, well, actually, okay, that specific, very clever pun is lost. But actually, because you've got the scaffolding from the rest of the story and this general kind of humor and sense of fun, it doesn't, I don't know, it's something, it is lost, but I don't think that the English reader would necessarily experience it as a loss. And also maybe something that can be gained is a more slightly, you know, that kind of, because the reasoning is not as clear, it becomes a little bit more surreal. And that can be, you know, fun in and of itself. To take another example from the same story, so there's like a line that I really like where the narrator's describing how when she kind of starts taking revenge on the horrible men of the world with gum, and gum, you know, it appears as an enormous toad, and these men feel very scared. And there's a line in the Japanese that just has a really wonderful rhythm to it, which is "Shishin suru hito mo iru, shikkin suru hito mo iru." And when I saw this, I was like, oh no, what am I going to do with that? And then I just played it around, and I realized that actually in English that can be, so what I've got it as in the text is some experience a loss of consciousness, some experience a loss of continence. And so, you know, it has that same, like this, the repetition of the words is, and that's not really anything to do with me, that's just how it works in English. So, you know, there are also those kind of fortunate parallels, I suppose. Yeah.
Yes, it's really interesting to hear about that particular story. Aoko-san, do you have any response to?
いや本当にその通りだなと思って、なんかやっぱりね、英語と日本語は違う言語だから同じ言葉を使って同じ効果を生み出すってことが不可能じゃないですか。でもなんかすごく大事だなと思うのは、その作品がやっている、なんていうんだろう、そのページでやってたりとか、その言葉がやっている同じ濃度の、なんていうか世界を作り出したらそれでいいって思っていて、いやなんていうんですかね、そのまま直訳とか、なんかもうすごく同じようにしなきゃとかよりは、もう違ったりとか、ちょっと意味が変わったりしても、同じ、なんていうんだろう、その遊び心とか、そういうなんていうか、楽しい部分を同じように、なんだろう、一緒じゃなくていいんですけど、同じ濃度の楽しさを生み出せる人っていうのが、やっぱりすごく、素晴らしい翻訳家さんなんじゃないかなと思っていて、なんかポリーさんはそういう点でものすごく信頼してるというか、なんていうか普段喋っていてもなんかやっぱり同じ時代に生きている人っていうなんていうんだろう、喋っていて思うというか、なんかすごく人間性から信頼してるので、なんかそういう部分ですごく信頼してるっていうところがあって、うん。なんかなんでこの話をなんか信頼していて、だからなんかそうですね、だから今の話ってやっぱそうだなと思いました。
I can tell that you have a really wonderful relationship, the author-translator relationship, through what you both just said. And I want to hear more about, you know, the translation process and working together process later. But first, I want to ask about literary influences. So this book is named after the famous 1963 children's picture book by Maurice Sendak, Where the Wild Things Are. And I'd like to ask Aoko-san to talk a little about why you're referencing this particular book. And also, if I may continue, when I was reading the story in one of the stories called Fox's Life, Kuzuha no Issho, I couldn't help thinking about Oba Minako's feminist classic story, The Smile of a Mountain Witch, Yamamba no Bisho, which deals with another female figure, this time from a Japanese folklore. The Yamauba, or the mountain witch figure, is an old hag who lives all alone in the mountains and catches and eats weary travelers. And in this story, the mountain witch learns how to navigate human society perfectly by fitting into social expectations and norms. And after her death, she finds her inner power and freedom by returning to the mountains. So I was just wondering in general who your literary influences are, or how do picture books or folk tales or other works of literature inspire you in your writing?
おばちゃんたちのいるところのタイトルをなぜ怪獣たちのいるところから取ったかというと、なんかいつだったか忘れたんですけど、だいぶ前に急に私の頭の中におばちゃんたちのいるところ Where the Wild Ladies Are っていうフレーズが頭にパッて両方浮かんだんですね。で、あーってなっ て、それをその時メモしたんですね。でそれが何になるかとか考えずにメモしてたんですけど、でその後にグランタで磨きをかけるを書いたりとかしてるうちに、このシリーズをもっとやりたいなと思うようになって、その時におばちゃんたちのいるところっていうタイトルを使って短編集ができるんじゃないかと思って、2つの要素がくっついたんですけど、なのでなんというか初めになんか怪獣たちのいるところにオマージュを捧げようとか思ったわけではなくて、先にパッとフレーズが浮かんでしまったので、それでやっぱりその引用したっていうのがはっきり分かるように作品の中にも絵本を出したんですね。でそうですね、誰に影響を受けたかというより、どういう作家が好きかっていう話でもいいかなっていう感じなんですけど、影響を受けたといえば、やっぱりこれまで生きてきた中で見聞きしたりとか読んだり見たりしたあらゆることがやっぱり自分の作品に溶け込んでいくものだと思っているので、やっぱりそれは全てっていうことだとも思うんですけど、なんか個人的に自分が好きな作家はやっぱなんかなんていうの、学生の時にものすごくなんというかなんか衝撃を受けたという意味で、シャーリー・ジャクソンのくじを読んだ時の衝撃っていうのはやっぱものすごく大きくって、それからものすごく彼女のファンなんですね。なのでなんですか、日本人の私の作品がその後なんかシャーリー・ジャクソン賞の候補になった時っていうのは結構本当に嬉しいことで、こういうふうにして彼女とつながることができるんだっていうことに驚いて、もともとそういうことが可能だとも思っていなかったので、賞を取りたいとかも一切思ってなかったので、あれは本当にすごく候補になったっていうことがものすごく嬉しかったんですね。で、あと好きな小説、常に好きな小説はキャッチ22が好きなのと、カート・ボネガットを結構若い頃に結構いろいろ読みました。で、あとそうですね、他にもいろいろ読んでるんですけど、短編がやっぱり好きで、そうね。で大学で英文学の学んでるんですけど、ゼミも短編小説のゼミだったので、毎週いろんな短編小説を読めたのがちょっと自分にとって大きかったなっていうのと、そうですね、あと日本の作家でものすごく今この人たちは本当にすごかったなと思っているのが石井桃子さんで、児童文学の翻訳者なんですけど、同時に小説も書かれていて、特に70代になってから書き始めたで、かなり遅くになってから書き始めた幻の赤い実っていう作品がやっぱり今読んだもこれ本当にすごい作品だったなって感じるのと、あと松田時子さんの「父を売る」っていうプロレタリア文学の作家さんの作品がなんというか全く今読んでも強度が色褪せない、同じ問題が同じようにそのまま残っているっていう意味でやっぱりこれの作品はすごいなっていうふうに思っています。
And I was interested in what you said about how the book collection came about. So you first came up with the title, which is such a great title, and then you wrote the Smartening Up Migaki o Kakeru for Granta. I didn't realize that came first, and then the short story collection. So I guess from the beginning, it was kind of a collaborative process as well with Polly. And then I was interested in what you said about the short story form. So Where the Wild Things Are, or no, Where the Wild Ladies Are, is a collection of very loosely linked short stories. And many of the other books that you've written, I think, also follow this form. And so would you say that this kind of loosely linked stories are your preferred genre of writing? And do you think that there are things that become possible to do in the short story form than the longer form of the novel maybe cannot do, or that's impossible to do in the longer form?
なんかパちゃんたちのいるところが英米で翻訳された時に書評とかで何個か結構目にして面白いなと思ったのはこれはもう長編じゃないのっていうようなことを書いてる人が結構いたんですね。それは緩やかにつながってるから って書いてて、でそこはすごく面白がってくれてる人たちが多いような印象を受けたんですけど、なんかやっぱりこの作品は個人的にはそれで長編かみたいになってちょっとだけ考えたんですけど、でもやっぱりこの作品は自分的には短編集じゃないといけなかったっていうところがあって、でなんでかっていうと短編の方がより遊べるんですよね。特に連作短編になったらその連作が足されたことによってさらにより遊べるんですよね。でおばちゃんたちのいるところはできるだけさっきも言いましたけど、できるだけ楽しさを追求する作品にしたかったので、楽しさを追求する意味ではやっぱりいろんなこと書き方だったりとか認証を変えるとかいろんな遊び方ができる短編が一番やっぱり合ってたと思います。でさっきも言ったみたいにやっぱすごく短編が好きで、なんでだろうとかよく考えるんです。やっぱりただ長い作品もものすごく好きなんですけど、同時にやっぱり短編に対する思いっていうのも結構強くって、それは多分今までいいタイミングなんていうかいい短編にいろいろ出会ってきて、その出会ったことによる衝撃が自分の体内にすごいやっぱりいくつもいくつも積み重なってるっていうところがあるので、やっぱり今まで面白い短編をいっぱい書いてきてくださった作家さんたちのおかげなんじゃないかなと思ってます。
Polly, do you have any thoughts on this as a translator to do with this issue of genre and form and playfulness? Can you give us any insights into what you feel this particular form of loosely linked short stories makes possible, either in this particular case or in general?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what I would say first and foremost is that my sense is that this form, this loosely interconnected short stories, is something that we really there's not a lot of precedence for in the West. The collection of interconnected stories does exist, but I think the connection there is much more comprehensive. I mean, in Where the Wild Ladies Are, there are a lot of characters that recur, and reading the whole thing, you do get a sense of how they fit together as a whole, but they are also completely standalone, and some of them seem, there aren't really any recurring characters. So it's the sense that, and I think that what that then means as a reader is that, the first time you read that collection, you might not notice so many things. And then, by the second and third reading, it's like you start to understand far more, how everything is kind of coming back, and these kind of very clever references that, you are very casual, so you might miss them the first time. And I think just from speaking to a lot of readers here, that's something that people have found genuinely exciting about this collection, because it just feels like something that they haven't seen done before. And definitely for me, when I first encountered this collection, that I also found it really rewarding. And that it just this I think that experience of gradually noticing things as a reader is a really satisfying one, because you get this sense which ties into the content of this book of Where the Wild Ladies Are, is that there's so much more going on there than you are capable of perceiving as a stupid human, and so that the reading experience itself is kind of highlighting to you how how dumb you are in comparison to the world of the ghosts, and the kind of the sense of this omniscient world around you that you're just gradually tapping into.
Yeah, I liked how you put that as a reading experience. I think I had a similar experience of kind of navigating through this world that is much deeper and much more profound and interesting. But as a mere human, as a mere reader, you're getting glimpses into this wonderful world that this novel is creating. So maybe we can move to the reading portion of this conversation. So Aoko-san and Polly will read a section from the story that we've been talking about, Smartening Up, Migaki wo Kakeru. And this is the opening story in the original Japanese version. And it's, we talked about different types of humor, but to me, this is so laugh out loud funny that it really immediately draws you into the world of the book. The protagonist in the story has just been dumped by her boyfriend, and the story opens with her interior monologue as she lies down for a hair removal treatment at a beauty clinic. And she chants to herself that she is a beautiful, intelligent, sexy, caring, and wait for it, hairless woman. So let me hand it over to Aoko-san and Polly for the reading.
はい、じゃあ読みます。小学生のあの日、正直歌舞伎は本当に同じ日本語かと思うくらい、一つも意味がわからなくて、初めの物語上の演目は、白塗りのおじさんが一人ずつ出てきて、全く理解できない言葉を長々と言っては、去っていったり、そこにそのままいたりするだけで、退屈で、お尻が痛くて、ようやく終わった時にはほっとした。
Back then, I hadn't been able to make out a word of what the kabuki actors said. Being just a child, I had trouble believing it was really Japanese they were speaking. In the first item of the program, middle-aged men came onto the stage one at a time, their faces painted white, talking at length in a language I couldn't understand. Some would go off stage when they were done, others would stay on. I was bored silly, my bottom ached, and when the play finally finished, I felt nothing but relief.
休憩時間になって、誰々いいわ、色っぽいわとか言い合いながら、お弁当の輪ゴムをペリペリ剥がし始めたお母さんとおばちゃんに、言葉がわからないから辛いと訴えたけれど、二人とも、何言ってんの、同じ日本人のくせに、大丈夫大丈夫と相手にしてくれなかった。いざとなったら、途中で抜けてロビーに避難しよう。そう決意して臨んだ次の演目は、幕が開いても、三味線や小さな太鼓を演奏しながら、また一つも理解できない言葉で、不思議な調子で歌うおじさんたちしか後ろに並んでいなくて、そこに着物の女の人、ほんまはおじさんやけど、が一人スススッと出てきて踊り始めた。それが清姫だった。
During the interval, as my mother and aunt rolled the rubber bands off their bento boxes, they discussed how good or how sexy this or that actor or scene had been. I tried to explain how it felt not to comprehend any of the dialogue, but neither of them took me seriously. What are you talking about? They said. They're speaking your language. Just listen carefully and you'll be fine. As the curtains went up for the next item in the program, I comforted myself that if things got really bad, I could always slip out midway and take refuge in the foyer. At the back of the stage, I saw a group of men playing shamisen and drums and singing things I didn't understand. And just as my heart began to sink, a woman in a kimono, though really it was a man in a kimono dressed as a woman, slipped out onto the stage and began to dance. That was Kiyohime.
清姫はすごかった。初めは可愛い感じで踊り出すんやけど、どんどん勢いを増していって、変な容器みたいなのを発し始めて、そのまま1時間ぐらいぶっ通しで踊り狂うのだ。清姫が初めから中に何枚も仕込んでいた着物を、静かに現れたそれ専門の係の人が、タイミングを合わせてその都度一枚一枚ぐいっと引っ張ると、清姫は踊ったままで、でも綺麗な着物がコロコロ変わって、魔法みたいで、手に持って踊るアイテムもいろいろ変わる。私はびっくりして、こんなん初めて見たと思って、前のめりで清姫の姿を見つめた。最後に、銀色に光る着物姿になった清姫は、寺の大きな鐘の上に堂々と仁王立ちになり、その鐘につくのだ。
Kiyohime was extraordinary. At first, her dance was a delicate, ladylike affair, but gradually her movements grew more and more powerful. There was something weird, almost otherworldly about that dance, and she went on dancing non-stop, like a mad thing, for about an hour. Kiyohime wore several kimonos on top of one another, which her assistants whipped off with perfect timing, so that as she danced, she twirled from one beautiful kimono to the next, and the objects she held in her hand were magically transformed. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before, and I leaned forward in my seat to watch her precise movements as closely as I could. In the final scene of the play, Kiyohime used her power to possess the enormous temple bell, and as she stood brave and magnificent on top of it, the silver kimono sparkled.
娘道成寺が終わった後、放心状態の私をおばちゃんは面白そうに眺めると、ほら食べとどら焼きをくれた。それから、あのキラキラ光る銀色の着物はな、蛇の鱗なんやでと教えてくれた。
After the play had ended, I was in a daze. I found my aunt peering at me with curiosity. Here, she had said, pressing a dorayaki into my small palm. Did you see that silver kimono Kiyohime wore at the end? The glittery one? I nodded. Snake scales.
清姫かっこよかったよな。しつこくてダイナミックでな。おばちゃんは急に暗み汚しに頬杖を突き出し、夢見るような瞳でうっとりと続けた。私も紅茶をすすいながらうなずく。確かに清姫はかっこよかった。うち思うねん。うちも清姫みたいに蛇の化身になるくらいしつこくすればよかった。だって30年やで。何その場はいい格好して大人の女ですみたいなふりしてさ、後で首つってんねんな。自分が情けないわ。呪い殺してやるぐらい当然や。そんなん別に悪いことちゃう。だって相手やと同じくらいのことやってんねん、うちに。潔いのなんて都合いいだけやわ。少しもかっこよくないわ。そう言うと、おばちゃんはクッキーをガリガリかじり始め、ガリガリかじりながら先を続けた。だからうち、開発中やねん、技を。技？今からでも遅くないんちゃうかと思ってな。こうやって姿を表せるようになるにも1年かかってん。これ技なん？そうやで、うちの努力の成果や。おばちゃん、もうこれで十分すごいで。いややん、こんなん普通やん。なんも思んない。あんたもうちが来た時思ったやろ？なんも思んないって。何普通に来とんねんって。うちはな、もっとおどろしくて、あの人の心に一生の傷を残すような、そういう技がいいねん。私は言うべき言葉が見つからなくて、自分もクッキーを口に突っ込んだ。めっちゃ美味しいけど、なんか味が上品すぎるような気がしてきた。あの時おばちゃんがくれたどら焼き、私はちゃんと食べたんやんか。
Kiyohime was wonderful, wasn't she? My aunt said now. So persistent, so dynamic. She rested her chin on her hands theatrically and continued, all dreamy-eyed. I should have done the same thing, you know. I should have stuck in there like she did, become a snake, done whatever it took. 30 years we were together. I don't know what I was thinking, trying to act cool and composed when I'd just been dumped, playing the grown-up, then going home and hanging myself. I mean, really, it was pathetic. I'd have been far better off placing a deadly curse on him. I'd have had every right too. It was what he deserved. For all his show of so-called chivalry, he just did whatever the hell he wanted. There's nothing less sexy than that. With that, my aunt took a big bite of a cookie and munched noisily. So that's why I'm developing a special trick. A special trick? I reckon it's still not too late. I spent this past year learning how to appear like this. Wait, this is a skill you learned? You bet. All the fruit of my own labours. Well, it's quite a trick. Don't be silly. This is nothing. There's no punch to it. I know you thought the same when I first turned up at the door. You wondered why, if I was a ghost, I was showing up at the door like a regular visitor. I want a special skill that's truly awesome. Something terrifying enough to scar him for life. Huh. Not knowing what I was supposed to say, I stuffed a cookie in my mouth. It was delicious, but I felt that the taste was a bit too delicate in some way, the perfume of vanilla too faint. I wondered now if I'd actually eaten the dorayaki that my aunt had given me in the theatre all those years ago, its sponge patties oozing with sweet bean jam.
なあ、話は戻るけど、あんたやったらわかるやろ？あんた、毛の力をみすみす手放すんか？知ってんで、二股男に振られて、自分磨きとか言って、ちまちま永久脱毛通い出したん。そんなん大して変わらんわ。その毛はな、あんたに残された唯一の野生や。 せっかくの野生なんやで。それで、その毛で、やれることを一度ちゃんと考えてみてほしいんや、うちはあんたに。つまらん男に振られたくらいで、急に牙抜かれたみたいにならんと、清姫みたいに頑張ってほしいねん。毛の力はあんたのパワーやで。おばちゃん、いちいちムカつくし、いちいち頭ぶっ飛んでんなと呆れながら。でも死ぬ前からちょっとこういう人やったな。急に自然の力がとか言い出して、手作り石鹸量産したり、変なで髪の毛髪の毛汚い赤毛に染めたりしてたもんな。と、私は生きてた頃のおばちゃんのことをいろいろ思い出した。おばちゃん面白かったよな。なんでおばちゃんが死ななあかんねん。おばちゃんの気持ちはよくわかった。あんなことがあったんやから無理もないけど、おばちゃんが死んで以来すっかり暗い茂のとこに行く前に、私のとこに来てくれた気持ちもありがたいような気さえしてきた。でも清姫、蛇の化身やん。ツルツルやん、蛇は。ふざけて言うと、細かいこといいんときいや、とおばちゃんはめんどくさそうに言ってこう続ける。なあ、知っとるか？娘道成寺には、二人道成寺っていう演目もあるんやで。おばちゃんは昔つけていた赤い口紅のようにベターっと笑った後、ふとすました顔になり、ピンク色の爪をした私の細い手を取った。私たち、もののけになりましょう。そこだけ急に東京弁になっておばちゃんは言った。
Anyway, I'm sure you understand what I'm getting at, don't you? You can't let the power of your hair slip away from you. You think you have to spruce yourself up after being dumped by that two-timing idiot. That's why you started going to that hair removal place. Can't you see that it's pointless? Your hair is the only wild thing you have left, the one precious crop of wildness remaining to you. I want you to think long and hard about what you could do with it. Rather than getting all sore because you got dumped by some worthless scumbag, I want you to fight like Kiyohime did. Your hair is your power. I hadn't failed to register how grating and how batty each and every one of my aunt's statements was. And as I reflected, I recalled that she had these kind of tendencies before she died too. In fact, I began remembering all sorts of things about her, how out of nowhere she'd started going on about the force of nature, producing huge batches of handmade soap and hennaing her hair a dirty reddish shade. She'd been an interesting person, I thought. Why did she have to die? Now, for the first time, I felt like I understood where she was coming from. I even felt grateful toward her for choosing to visit me over Shigeru, despite the black cloud that had, quite understandably, been hanging over him since her death. But Kiyohime turns into a snake, right? Snakes don't have any hair at all, I joked. That's not what I'm saying. My aunt seemed totally bored by my pedantry. Did you know that in some performances of the Maid of Dojo Temple, they have two dancing maids? She shot me a great sassy smile, as if she were once again wearing the bright red lipstick of bygone days. Then, her expression suddenly serious, she took my slender hands in hers, pink nails and all. Let's become monsters together, she said, looking straight into my eyes.
Wow, thank you so much. That was a wonderful reading. I think the dialogue in this story and the whole book is really one of the amazing aspects of this whole collection. And it was such a treat to get to hear both of you read from the dialogue especially. So I have some questions. So I think the stud aunt character is probably my favorite. I love her. So Aoko-san, can you tell us about how you came up with this stud aunt character as a ghost, and also the central theme of hair? And how does this hair link with the story of the Dojoji temple, which came up in the section that we just read?
そう、それでなんか、そう、おばちゃん、そうなんですよね。おばちゃん、なんでおばちゃんを描いたのか、なんかちょっと、なんでおばちゃんが出てきたんだろうなと思うんですけど、なんかその娘道成寺は、私もなんか母に連れられて、母が歌舞伎が好きなので、母に連れられて見に行った時に、全く予備知識がない状態で見て、そしたらこの物語に出てくる女の子みたいに、 いきなり急にティア姫がわーって出てきて1時間近く目の前で踊られ続けるっていうのを目にしたんですけど、それがものすごく面白くて、なんか娘道成寺の面白いところって踊りだけなので本来の物語はもうみんな知っている前提でやるんですね。で男の人が出てこないんです。でそれで本当にティオ姫にフィーチャーされていて、でその状態で彼女が1時間踊り続けるっていう状態が本当に面白くてびっくりして、それでやっぱりそのティオ姫の役をやってる人によって違うと思うんですけど、私の時の人は結構こっちを上げてくるんですよ。なんか結構こっちのなんかテンションも上げてくるので、観客側のなんか本当に会場がティオ姫最高みたいになるんですよね。で最後本当に鐘の上にガーッて登って、わーってなんか大きい声で最後雄たけびを上げて終わったんです。でなんかその経験が結構自分的には本当に大きくて、その時のこの面白さは何だろうっていうのを再現したかったんですね、文章の上で。でそれがなぜ物語になったかっていうと、やっぱちょっと自分的にも自分言語化できないところがあって、気がついたらああなっていたっていう感じなんですけど、おばちゃんでもやっぱりそこも世代のそのさっき幽霊になった女性たちと現代の女性たちの時を超えたつながりを書きたかったって言ったと思うんですけど、世代の違う女性たちのつながりも書きたかったので、そういう意味で上の世代で幽霊になってしまったおばちゃんと若い女の子のつながりを描く物語にしたんだと思うんですけど、そうなんですよね。だからなんか私にとってなんか道成父って本当娘道成寺の踊り1時間の経験なんですよねっていう感じなんですけど、だからあんまりどういう物語で今読んでどういう話かみたいな、今読んでどう思うかみたいなことにあまり意見がないくらい時の1時間の印象が強いっていう感じです。
And what about the hair aspect? What was the significance of hair in your mind in writing the story?
なんか、ずっとそうなんですけど、すごい毛にとらわれてるなと思っていて、その頃特になんかちっちゃい時っていうか、私小学生、こんなことで話するのはちょっとあれなんですけど、小学生ぐらいの時に自分で毛を抜くのがすごい好きだったんですよ。でなんかすごい自分で毛を抜いて、なんかそうすると毛がなくなってツルツルになったりするのが面白くって、そのなんか範囲を増やして遊んでたりとかしてたんですけど、それはいいんですけど、そういう感じで結構毛を昔から面白いなと思っていて、で大人になったら今度は毛がない状態が好ましいと女性は特にされていて、今度脱毛の文化が自分たちの生活に特に日本人は毛が黒いので目立つので脱毛文化が欠かせないみたいなノリが入ってきて、なんかそれに疑問を抱かずに私も毛を剃ったりしていてどんどん年を取っていった時に、ある時この毛にかけてる時間って結構なもんなんじゃないだろうかとか思ったりとか、そういうなんていうんですかね、なんで普通に生えてるものをない方がいいみたいな謎の価値観を気がついたら信じて同じことをやってるのかなっていうことに気がついて、でもそれでやめるとかでもなくて、別にそういうことを小さくいろいろ考えるのが結構性分で、なんていうんですかね、やめるわけでもなく考えながらやってたんですけど、そういうなんていうか毛に対する不思議が頭の中で結構いろいろあったので、それを短編にしたいなっていう思いもあって、で今回のその磨きをかけるにテーマ的にも合うんじゃないかなと思って、なんていうんですかね、その理想の女性像への抑圧というか、優しくいつもちゃんと外見を整えていて出しゃばらずいつもニコニコ笑顔でみたいな、そういう社会的な抑圧みたいな中で生きているので、そこに その理想の女性っていうのは誰にとっての理想なのかっていうような問いを投げかけるような作品になりました。
Polly, you gave such a great reading of that scene. When I was reading the original, I was so struck by the speech of the Obachan, the dead aunt, and how kind of humorous and distinct her voice is. And I was really wondering how you were going to translate it. But hearing you read, reading it, but also hearing you read it aloud, I realized that you really made her come alive. And that very distinct Osaka dialect, even though, of course, this dilemma of how to translate dialect comes up in every translation talk, but I really felt like you conveyed the spirit and the humor. So wonderfully done. So I wanted to ask about that, and also, how do you go about translating speech or styles that are so distinct in the original? Yeah, how do you deal with that?
Thank you so much for saying that. That's really nice to hear. Yeah, I mean, I feel that this maybe falls into a similar category actually to what I was saying about the humor before, in the sense that, I think both people looking from the outside and also me, when I first approach it, there's a tendency to sort of like really fetishize these aspects, like the Osaka ben, which obviously, the Osaka accent for the aunt in the original story feels like a very distinctive feature. But, I personally kind of feel like it feels like that because it ties in so neatly with her personality, and we just have this very strong sense of her personality. And I feel like as a translator, when you are working with accents, regardless of whether or not how much you decide to kind of try and incorporate into that speech, that's the premise that you've got to be working with, is this sense of a personality in your head. And so, like, usually the way that I deal with that now, I think in the past I've kind of had different approaches, but I think these days, like, rather than aiming for any specific regional accents in English, because I think that can be quite problematic, I just try to sort of imagine that character and then imagine her speaking and go from there, I suppose. I mean, I think there are also things like, adding in sort of glosses that would explain that she was from Osaka or whatever, that, in the original wouldn't necessarily be there because they're obvious to any Japanese reader. Yeah, I think, again, it comes back to this sort of what Aoko was saying as well, sort of rather than honing in on the kind of the particulars, it's like about, I think most of translation for me is like about understanding the mode or the spirit or the voice or whatever you want to call it, kind of, rather than working just from the words on the page, kind of building up this whole sense and writing from that, I suppose.
In the latest issue of Monkey, which is a literary journal that introduces contemporary Japanese writings into English translation, Polly, you talked about the words obasan and ojisan, maybe especially ojisan, as being difficult to translate. So could you elaborate on this? And also with this collection, it's obachan. Aoko-san could also jump in as well, but what is obachan? How do you, I mean, the word wild ladies, I guess, was provided by Aoko. with the title, but what's both of your takes on who this Oba-chan is to someone who doesn't understand Japanese?
おばちゃん、おばちゃんはある年齢から上の女性を総称する言葉なんですけど、特に何ですかね、おばちゃんってすごくカッコに入れられやすい言葉っていうか、おばちゃんってこういうもんだよねみたいなイメージが世の中の中にあって、なんていうか、ある一定以上の年齢より上になった女性はもう女性じゃなくておばちゃんになるっていうか、個人として見られなくなるような、そうじゃないことももちろんあるんですけど、そういうような大きいくくりで言うとそういうようなイメージもあって、で私がおばちゃんをタイトルに入れたかったのは、おばちゃんが本のタイトルに入ってる小説とかってほとんどないんですよ。それはちょっとネガティブなイメージを持つから。それをポジティブなイメージに書き換えたくって、わざとおばちゃんっていう言葉をタイトルに入れたんですね。で、その作品の中でやりたかったのが、なんというか、毎日毎日生きていて、いろいろ考えて、いろいろ思いながら日々を暮らしているいろんな女性の生活を書きたいと思ったっていうところもあって、それがおばちゃんたちのいるところなんですよね。だから何て言うんだろう、ちょっとおばちゃんのイメージをカッコに入りやすいおばちゃんのイメージをカッコから外すためにおばちゃんっていう言葉をタイトルに入れたんですけど、それが英語になるとどうなるかっていうのをポリーさんにお話しいただきたいです。
Thanks, Aoko, for that. That's a really useful kind of framework for me to explain sort of why I find it difficult to work with, because I think we just don't have that kind of, we don't categorize people that way in English. I mean, I think the most sort of literal translation is middle-aged woman or middle-aged man, but I personally feel like what people understand, what people understand to be middle age is quite variable, and B, it just doesn't have the same set of connotations as in Japanese. So in Aoko's latest novel, called The Sustainable Use of Our Souls, she imagines a world where, from which the oji-san disappear, so the middle-aged men. And, in English, kind of, middle-aged men just doesn't have that same weight. If you kind of, in Japan, it's a really common thing to kind of discuss the way that oji-san behave, which is often quite misogynist, dismissive to women, impolite to people, generally quite truculent, for example. And middle-aged men in English just doesn't really have that connotation. You can then go down the road to kind of towards old guys or stuff like this, but there's also the thing in Japanese that there's sort of an upper age limit for oba-san and oba-chan and oji-san, because then after that you become an oji-san or an oba-san, which is a different thing again. So I have struggled with this. I continue to struggle with it in all aspects of translation, and I think I probably will forever. I don't think there is a fixed solution, and I think my technique is sort of just to approach it on quite a case-by-case basis and say, like, okay, what is this doing here? Just quickly on the subject of the title, if someone had given me the Japanese title to translate, I don't think that in a million years I would have translated it as Where the Wild Ladies Are. And that was just sort of handed to me. And I think lady has some quite I would be hesitant to use the word lady, because I think lady has some quite sort of problematic connotations in English sometimes in this day and age. But actually, I now really think it really works, and it's sort of, there's a slight, I think English readers find it a very unexpected title, much more than they would do anything I would have come up with, and I'm actually really happy with how that works, which possibly suggests a direction for translating kind of Obachan in the future, which is more, to kind of embrace something more odd, and then you gradually come to sort of you're giving it a new meaning through repeated use.
So my last question, I know we're running out of time now, but my last question has to do with the success that Japanese literature has been having around the world in recent years. And it seems that especially Japanese women writers are enjoying a lot of attention with the help of wonderful translators like Polly and also Lucy, Allison, and Jenny. And one of the key themes that emerge out of these contemporary female authors' works, in my view, is the questioning of norms. That word has come up already in this talk. And I'm thinking of authors like, of course, Matsuda Aoko-san, but also Kawakami Mieko or Murata Sayaka or Hitomi. And of course, I don't want to put all of these women into one category, since each author, I think, is so creative and wonderful in their own ways and have very, very distinct writing styles. At the same time, when you take a step back, these writers seem to be writing with a critical eye towards society in which we live and which we are pressured to accept as normal. And so my question to Aoko-san is, we could say that literature in every age has always, questioned these norms as part of its social function. But do you think there's something unique about the sheer number of women writing and getting noticed now, both in Japan and abroad, and the themes that they're dealing with? And do you see yourself in conversation with some of these contemporary women, either in Japan or in other cultural contexts?
そうですね。なんか今はすごく日本の女性がジェンダーのこととかそういう社会規範について書いていて、女性がすごく活発に書いてますよねっていうようなことを私もよく取材で言われるんですね。でそれはもちろん本当その通りなんですけど、同時に思うのは、これまでもずっとさっき吉尾さんが言ったみたいに、これまでもずっと書いてきたのになっていうような不思議もあるんですよね。でやっぱり読み直したりとか、新しく昔の女性作家さんのさっきの大場美奈子さんの山姥の微笑もそうなんですけど、読むと書いてんじゃんと思うんですよね。それでこれは何なんだろうと思うと、やっぱり彼女たちの声を聞く人、何を書いているかをちゃんと理解する人の数が増えたから今の現状が作られていて、書く側はもちろん増えているのかもしれないんですけど、書く側というより聞く側、読める側の人たちが増えてるんじゃないかなという印象があって、でもちろんそれは女性たちだったりとか、いろいろな問題や違和感について書き続けてきた人たちが書き続けてきて、声を上げ続けてきたから今の現状が作られていて、さらに書く人が増えたっていう状況だと思うんですね。だからなんかやっぱり今声を上げたりとか書いてる女性だったりとか、いろんな作家がすごいんではなくて、これまで書き続けたりとか声を上げ続けてきてた人たちがやっぱりすごいから、今私たちも書き続けたりとか話すことができるっていうことだと思うんですね。でなんだか母数が増えたことによって同時に聞いたりとか理解できる人が増えたってことだと思っていて、もちろんすごくいいことだと思ってます。
I completely understand what you're saying. How about you, Polly? You've translated other authors like Tomoka Shibasaki and Kikuko Tsumura. would you agree about this assessment about contemporary women's writing? Do you find this question of norms to be true in other works you've translated? If so, or if not, are there other themes or trends that you see today?
You know, I feel like this is such a big and complex question, especially when it's in the context not only of one kind of publishing market, but, you know, looking at the Japanese market and the Western market and Japanese books in English translation. You know, there's so many complex questions there. I mean, I think my feeling would be that, as you said, like basically all literature, or at least all good literature, is about questioning norms. And to the extent that, you know, we're seeing more works by Japanese women, like the norms that they are questioning might be, or are often more related to gender, but that's not necessarily the case. You know, I think Shibasaki Tomoka is a really good example of someone who is a very interesting writer who is a woman, but is not writing, I don't think, in it, you know, her theme is not gender for the majority of what she writes. And I think, you know, just to speak in terms of translation and then the kind of the currents, it's interesting because I think, you know, probably especially after the success of Convenience Store Women in the West, but I think maybe particularly in the UK, that has then created a pattern for, you know, what sells. And because especially in terms of translated fiction, people working at publishing companies tend to operate with a model of, you know, drawing upon precedents and saying, like, look, we know this sells, we know this kind of contemporary Japanese women's fiction with a feminist twist sells, give us some more. You know, then that kind of creates a pattern in the same way that, you know, I've said this before, but in the same way that when I first started out in the translation world, everyone was looking for the next Murakami, you know, and that's gone now. But instead, people tend to be looking for the next Convenience Store Women. And yeah, sorry, I could go on talking about this forever. But in summary, I think there's a lot of complex questions. Actually, one thing that I will say that I think is vaguely tangentially related, but is really interesting to me, is the way that, you know, now if you look at the Japanese versions of Aoko's books, but especially Where the Wild Ladies Are, you know, the belly bands will talk about, you know, this was chosen as a top 10 book in Time magazine, or, you know, it's all referencing kind of how successful it has been in the States, particularly. And so that, right. So then, yeah. So it's really interesting to me how we often think of like translation as kind of a one-way street, but it actually, you know, it feeds back into the Japanese market as well. I just think that's really fascinating.
Yeah, thank you. That's so interesting to think about the author, you know, and discuss literary work in terms of the author, but, you know, Aoko brought up the aspect of readership, and then Polly's discussion of the literary market and the role of translation. All of that has been so fascinating. Thank you so much. I think I should probably give the microphone back to Lucy at this point, so that she can ask some questions. But thank you so much to both of you.
Hello again. Wow, well, that was really a fantastic discussion. It really took off. I think you've more or less covered everything. I don't know whether I can ask anything that will shed any more light on this amazing collection. But let me ask just a couple of questions from Strong Women Soft Power as sort of coders to the previous discussion. Let me go straight to a question about horror. Some of the story, just to kind of supplement a little bit of the discussion that preceded. Some of the stories that you reference in this collection have aspects of horror in their original forms. In Yotsuya Kaidan, which is referenced in one of the stories in your collection and is perhaps Japan's most famous ghost story, Oiwa, the female figure who is poisoned and murdered by her callous lover, comes back to haunt him, emerging from a lantern, her face horrifyingly disfigured from the poison, terrorizing him as he lies in bed with his new lover, eventually causing him to go mad and come to a bad end. Horror makes us feel fear and disgust, but it can evoke other types of effects in the viewer or reader as well. For example, it might evoke pity for the powerlessness of the female protagonist, who is usually a wronged woman, or empathetic satisfaction when she appears and wreaks her revenge. There's a kind of power that the genre of horror sometimes confers on women figures. And it seemed to me when I read this wonderful collection that the motivation, if I can talk of it like that, was very much a de-othering one, de-othering women, making them seem less other. There is a lot of detoxifying and defanging and humanizing of women going on. And I'm wondering whether you ever felt a certain regret or wistfulness at letting go of this element of horror in these stories, or perhaps you feel that you did retain a certain element of horror in them. And what does horror mean for you, I guess is what I'm asking, and also Polly too.
私はものすごい怪談とかゴーストストーリーがすごい好きな人間なんですけど、そうね、この作品でやりたかったのは、何が彼女たちをホラーにしているかっていうところに焦点を当てたかったんですね。ただ、そうすることによって作品の中からホラーの要素が消えたかといえば、そうではなくって、その彼女たちをホラーにさせている社会のシステムこそがホラーだっていうふうに思うんですけど、そこは残っていて、だからなんていうんですかね、本当のホラーは残っているっていう感じですかね。
What do you mean exactly? What remains is true horror? 松田さん。
その社会の何ですかね、その女性たちをひどく扱ったりとか、その階段の中で例えばお菊井戸の話だったら女性お菊がそのお皿を割ったというだけの理由で井戸に投げ込まれて死ぬわけですよね。ですごいひどい話なんですけれども、そういうような女性をなんかひどい扱いをしたりとか、そもそもなんていうんですかね、低い立場に置いているっていうような初めにも言いましたけど、その男性優位的な社会のシステムが今もそのまま、ある意味で残っているので、その意味で昔の女性と今の女性がつながっているってさっき話したと思うんですけど、それと同じでその社会のシステムこそが本来のホラーなんですよね。元凶的なそのホラーのせいによって女性たちがホラーにされているっていうような流れがあるんですけど、なぜかそのシステムの方のホラーは見過ごされて、女性がホラーだ怖いっていうようななんていうんですかね、解釈をされる話がすごく多いなっていうふうに思っていて、だからその 女性たち、その怖いものとして扱われてきた女性から怖い要素を抜いたんですけど、本来の元凶であるホラーは作品の中にそのまま残しているので、そういう意味ではホラーストーリーのままだと思っています。
Polly, do you have anything to?
Yeah, I think I don't really have much to add to that, but I think this sort of ties in to what I was saying at the beginning about why I feel like this book is actually quite kind of conceptually ambitious and radical, in that, you know, it sort of, I feel like it reveals this mechanism at the heart of the horror story, which is basically a sort of displacement, you know, that actually it's a way of taking what is actually terrifying and, you know, projecting it onto the victim, you know, in which is more or less the same kind of mechanism as fascism. And actually, so this book's, I agree with Aoko that it kind of still contains all the elements of horror, but they're just in a different order, and we can see the actual kind of causal structure much better. And, you know, Lucy, to return to your question, and you were saying kind of horror can give us a sense of empathy and pity. You know, I still feel, I feel that this book definitely still has those, like, far more than kind of the traditional ghost story, I suppose.
Yes, I see. Well, I think we're close to the time limit, sadly. Maybe I can just ask one final question to you both. You strike me as quite a unique pair, at least in this series, at any rate, because you're both writers and you're both translators. Both of you write and translate and swim around in each other's language. I have a really nosy question. Do you help each other in your translations at all? Do you consult each other in your translations? I mean, Matsuda-san mentioned that she absolutely trusts you, your sense and judgment in dealing with her works. But do you consult Matsuda-san as you translate her works, or do you eschew that? And also, this is very, very nosy, but does Matsuda-san, when she's translating into Japanese, various works from the English language, do you consult Polly ever, or is that something that you don't do? That's very nosy. And also, maybe I can ask you to end by giving us an idea of what you're both engaged in now, both in translation and writing. That would be wonderful to know.
私もめちゃくちゃポリさんに質問をしまくっていて、自分が小説、アメリカ文学のとか英米の小説とか絵本を翻訳するときにわからないことをものすごくポリさんに LINE でひたすら聞いてしまうっていう悪い癖があって、ポリーさんにすごい迷惑をかけてしまっていて、それで今年は私翻訳の年でちょっと翻訳を頑張らないといけないので、これからまたポリーさんのところにものすごい LINE が届くと思います。
What are you translating?
カレン・ラッセルのオレンジワールドっていう翻訳小説、短編集を翻訳していて、それをね、本当に今年が頑張らないと間に合わないので、ちょっとポリさんよろしくお願いしますっていう感じなんですけど、ポリさんの方は今からポリさんも言うと思いますけど、とても優秀なので、ほとんど質問を私の作品についての質問は時々ありますけど、他の作品について質問されたことが一度もないので、ポリさんはすごく優秀です。
I actually really love answering Aoko's questions about other texts. I find it really fascinating. So yes, bring them on anytime. I do, of course, ask Aoko questions when I'm translating her stuff. I think, you know, one of the things that I find really nice about working with Aoko is, like, she understands what translation is about, you know. So sometimes I can go to her with a question that I maybe wouldn't ask another author because I think it might freak them out. and sort of say, you know, I've got a problem here. It's like, can I approach this in quite a creative way? And you know, Aoko, being the wonderful person that she is, has been really, really accommodating about that in the past. One example was that was in A Fox's Life, when there was a whole issue with looking like a fox not being thought of as sexy, but obviously, like, in English we have this word foxy, which meant that was going to make things very difficult. And so I kind of explained the situation to Aoko and said, you know, is it okay to basically sort of add in a bit to make this read sensibly, coherently in English? And she was, you know, really understanding and open about that. Whereas I think for authors who maybe don't have an understanding of what that process is like, it might more be like, why are you trying to kind of, you know, put your own stamp on my work?
Yes, or it's obvious, isn't it? It means this, you know,
right.
You know, job done. Yeah. And what are you working on, Polly, right now? Can you tell us, or is it top secret?
I don't think it's top secret. I am working at the moment on a Kanae Miyako novel, which is very exciting and very difficult. But yeah, a lot of fun.
Just translation, you're not producing a sequel to 50 Sounds, or no?
I
not
might
yet.
be working on something, but that definitely is top secret.
Oh, okay, well, that's very exciting. All right, well, I think we've reached our time limit. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for your time and for answering all the questions so generously. And I would also like to thank our interpreter, Bethan Jones. Strong Women, Soft Power, Alison Markin-Powell, Ginny Tapley Takemori, and I would like to reiterate our deep appreciation to the Japan Foundation for providing us with a platform to share just a little of the richness of contemporary Japanese writing with viewers. Thank you very much. Shun-san.
Thank you for that, Lucy-san. And like you said, that's all the time we have for today's discussion. I'd like to thank our wonderful guests for their time. We hope that the viewers at home were able to enjoy this session and get some insight into the fascinating world of Japanese literature and translation. So for our next session, which will feature the author Yoko Ogawa in discussion with the journalist Motoko Rich and her translator, Professor Steve Snyder, will be coming up in just a few weeks' time. So do please stay out for that. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for our newsletter, where we'll keep you updated about our upcoming events and info in the near future. And finally, if you enjoyed today's session, it would be a huge help to us if you could fill out the short questionnaire in the description box below. And also, if you have any questions you would like to ask our guests for the next episode, we have also provided a link below as well. Once again, thank you all for your time. And until our next session, please continue to stay safe, take care, and we'll see you again soon. Goodbye.